Democratic Congressman Mike Quigley of Illinois sits on the House Intelligence Committee. Steve Schmidt is a political strategist and MSNBC contributor. And Yamiche Alcindor is the White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour and an MSNBC contributor. Let me go to Congressman Quigley. It's not just that he's a Russian. It's not just that he's a former Soviet. But Vladimir Putin is a KG agent of his whole time. He is a sworn-in, duty-bound spy. That's what he's done his whole career. That's what he is. He could do anything, probably engaged in torture, personally has done it all, and we're inviting him into the home of the President of the United States. What do you make of that protocol violence?
It's scary. I've now served on the Intel Committee for about 3.5 years. I have the greatest respect for the members of that community. Many of them have given their lives to keep us safe, and here we are attacking them. Since before he was president of the United States, as candidate Trump, attacking the intelligence community and defending and never attacking Mr. Putin. It is beyond description.
Steve, what would you make of a Democratic president? Or what do you think a lot of people on the Trump side, those who are lining up behind him again, 4 out of 5 Republicans backing him on his Helsinki behavior, what would they have done if Barack Obama had kowtowed to a Soviet or Russian leader like this guy has, who suggested subjecting American officials like our former Ambassador McFaul to be dragged over to Moscow for interrogation, would then on top of that invite the leader of the former head of the KGB, come to the White House for din-din? Well, what do you think would have been the reaction from the solid Trumpites at that thought?
Well, President Obama, if he had done that, would have been impeached already, for sure. The most mystifying thing about all of this is the utter complicity of the Republican majority in failing to stand up to a president who has distinguished himself with his singular dishonor. He is the first American president in the history of the American Republic who refuses to defend the country from the attack launched on it by a hostile foreign power at the order of the president of Russia. The Russian Federation launched a cyber war against the United States, interfering in our election process. It is an attack on our sovereignty. This is what George Washington warned the country about in his farewell address, and it is remarkable to watch this play out this week and to see over on Fox State TV all the excuse making, all the gymnastics that are going on, trying to excuse Trump from this.
Yamiche, the president who was a candidate, as a candidate, promised to put America first. And I understood that. No more stupid wars, no more kowtowing, no more taking crap from anybody. Why is he taking everything in the face from Putin? Everything. The attacks, the suggestion they wanted McFaul, our former ambassador, to come back there and be interrogated by the KGB, like his crowd, that's who they are, and then to get invited to dinner at the White House. What every one of these dictators wants is to be treated like a human being at the highest level by our country. And now Trump's giving him exactly what Putin wants, to be treated like a human being, which he's not. Your thoughts?
Well, I was at that Helsinki summit and in the room when that press conference happened. And it wasn't just that President Trump is treating President Putin as if he's a human being and someone who should be respected. In that regard, he was really someone, he was allowing President Putin to be the host almost. Even though the summit was happening in Finland, it almost could have been happening in Russia because he spoke first. He was someone who clearly had the body language. You could tell that he was having a good time. President Putin was smiling all the while.
Yes.
And this was really about President Trump saying, I am the rightful president of the United States and that I don't owe Russia anything for my victory, because this has become so personal for him. So his message has really been America first, but really it's about Trump being first. And all the people that I talked to today, I was really talking to a lot of sources from the Department of Homeland Security and former senior officials from the Department of Justice who deal with national security. And all of them said that the national intelligence community is really worried about what President Trump said to President Putin in that 2-hour meeting. They're really worried that he made assurances with President Putin and gave away things that the U.S. doesn't even know what happened yet. So I think there's this idea that the intelligence community, from my reporting, is really, really scared.
Steve, I'll get the congressman in a moment. I want to ask Steve about something because you're such a smart political guy. And I'm going to ask you this. Didn't you get the sense watching Putin he had the secondary characteristics of a guy who's a torturer and likes his job? He had that smirk on his face. You know, as Yamiche just said, he had that attitude of, I got this guy in my captivity. I'm enjoying this. This is the kind of torture I like as a KGB expert.
Vladimir Putin is a KGB colonel. He was and always will be that. And I think the way that he looked at Donald Trump is the way that a con man looks at his mark. He saw somebody who was standing next to him that is clearly doing his bidding by design, whether it's a sin of omission or commission. I can't explain. I don't know what's in Donald Trump's heart. I don't know what's in his head. But there's a term the Russians use. It's useful idiot. And the president of the United States is a Russian useful idiot. He is foursquare doing the bidding of the Russian autocrat. He is savaging the Western alliance. He's weakening NATO. He's assaulting the European Union, the U.S.-led liberal global order. These are all the primary and fundamental strategic goals of the Russian Federation: to weaken NATO, to weaken the European Union, to weaken trust, faith, and belief in democratic institutions across the West. And the person more than any other human being on all the planet that is doing the bidding of Vladimir Putin to achieve those ends is the American president. It is an extraordinarily dangerous moment to ponder as we look at the events of this last week.
And now the tough question. Congressman, are you people going to let this guy, this KGB colonel, into the House chamber to address the House in a joint meeting? If Trump asks you to do that, the final straw, will you go along with it?
You know, I don't think we will, but it's up to Speaker Ryan. If today's any indication, I don't hold out much hope. My amendment up today would have provided additional resources to battle and protect our election security. It failed on a party line vote. The same people, the same Republicans who tweeted out disagreeing with the president's actions in Helsinki, today voted against providing resources to prevent cyber hacking, provide training and equipment, because our equipment is so old it can't even handle anti-hacking software.
Right.
We have 13 states that don't even have a paper background. Against that backdrop, Mr. Coates talked about how they're coming after us again on election hacking. My Republican colleagues did nothing.
Well, it'd be great if you introduced a resolution, even if it won't get passed by the Republican majority. It would challenge them at least to say it is the will of the House that this man who oversaw an attempt to disrupt and discredit our electoral process, the essence of our Republican form of government, will not speak in this House. That would be great. Any chance of that happening? Are the Democrats pushing Pelosi and the rest of you folks, pushing that resolution and forcing the Republicans either eat it or fight it?
I agree. We're going to continue to fight. Today was full-throttled engagement with them. The Republicans sitting on their hands while the Democrats voted to secure our country's election infrastructure, chanting USA.
Well, I hope you challenge Mr. Ryan to show some guts and say no to the president. It's an embarrassment. He's coming here. It'd be a worse embarrassment if we put him in the well of the House to speak to the country. Meanwhile, in his most recent attempt to address the fallout over Helsinki, President Trump is claiming he's been tough on Russia. Believe it? Well, while trying to cast his predecessor, Barack Obama, as being beholden to Russia. Remember that? I don't. Let's watch.
Look at the sanctions I've put on. Look at the diplomats I threw out. Look at all of the things that I've done. Nobody else did what I've done. Obama didn't do it. Obama was a patsy for Russia. He was a total patsy. Look at the statement he made where he thought the mics were turned off, okay? The stupid statement he made. Nobody does a big deal about that. Getting along with President Putin, getting along with Russia is a positive, not a negative. Right. Now, with that being said, if that doesn't work out, I'll be the worst enemy he's ever had. The worst he's ever had.
You mean the sanctions, it seems to me, came about under Obama, and it was Trump's people who kept talking during the campaign. That's what this investigation's about relieving those sanctions in some sort of quid pro quo.
Well, the White House really does have that same kind of talking points when you ask them about the U.S. policy toward Russia. They'll say we expelled people, we closed Russian consulates all over the country. So there's this idea that there is things on, and the president said he has not at all reduced any sanctions when it comes to Russia. The bigger point is I was talking to the former U.S. representative to NATO. His name is Douglas Lute, and he was saying that NATO allies, when they see the way that President Trump is acting, that they are going to start crafting workarounds for the United States because they will not trust the United States when it's under President Trump. So you have this idea that while he's saying that, okay, well, I haven't taken away sanctions or I haven't done anything, he didn't say the word sanctions in that press conference. Nowhere in that press conference did he say we're going to keep our sanctions strong. So there's this idea that even if the policy is strong for now, people, including NATO allies, are already looking at President Trump and saying, we don't trust that guy.
Let me ask about Steve. Tell me about Christopher Wray. His conversation today with Lester Holt of NBC. It seemed to me that he talked about resigning. He was so concerned about Trump's behavior.
Well, look, I think you see the remarkable video from the Aspen Security Conference with the National Director of Intelligence, Dan Coates, similarly surprised. Look, at the end of the day, when you look at Donald Trump's Putin fetish, when you look at the things that he did over the last 10 days, his attacks on the NATO allies, his destabilizing of that alliance, and lastly, the weakest performance by an American president, the head of state of the United States, standing next to a foreign leader in the history of electronic recordings of these type of events. We've never seen a weaker performance by a president of the United States standing next to any leader, let alone one that has attacked the country, that has attacked the elections process, that is responsible for war crimes across the Middle East, the annexation of his neighboring states, and his attempts to weaken liberal democracy all across the world. Not a single line of opposition to him. It was gutless, it was weak, it was servile, and it is unprecedented for an American president to show that type of weakness. And I think that when you look at why is he doing this, there are no good answers. And I think that increasingly, as we look forward, this president is becoming more unhinged. He's becoming more erratic. His behavior is becoming more alarming with each passing day. And though there are all sorts of people that are trying to excuse it away, the whole country just saw what they saw with their own eyes. And it's not good for this president. It's certainly not good for the United States.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.